The Holy Gospel according to St. Luke, the 9th chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
Now about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw two men, Moses and Elijah, talking with him. They appeared in glory, and were speaking of his departure, which was about to be accomplished in Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they stayed awake, they saw his glory, and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how long must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions, but Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. This is the gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
So here we are today on this Transfiguration Day. This funny little white day tucked in between Christmas and Easter. A transition day, if you will, between the drawdown of the last season and the run-up to the next. This event depicted on Mount Tabor that has a name that is not used really anywhere else in the world. That was a very legitimate question asked earlier. What does this word mean? It's a really good question. It's not a word that we use anywhere else in the world. Say Hasbro's Transformers. You know, growing up in the Transformer generation, the Transfiguration makes a little bit more sense. You know, the Greek word for it is metamorphothe. Metamorphosize, change. Which we really don't use that very often, except maybe in Marvel's comics or unless you're a biologist or in medicine. But we celebrate this event today. There's grand pictures painted, stained glass made. But what is really the big deal here? What's really the point of us being up on the top of Mount Tabor? Is this a significant event in the life and understanding of Jesus? Yes, it is. And it's also a significant event in the life of the disciples then and now. Up on the mountain, that was the closeness of God. You were in the presence of the divine. Jesus takes with him Peter and James and John, the big three, and they go up on the mountain to pray. Now they know him or believe him to be the Messiah, the promised one of God, and subject to the rule and authority and will of the Scriptures, like all of the other people of God. For them, Jesus stands equal to, shoulder with, the big ones, the heroes of faith. Jesus would be co-equal to Moses and Elijah and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. The Messiah is the last and the greatest in the line of God's work. but looked upon in similar reverence as all of the other greats in the Old Testament. This event is meant to settle that. And that though the disciples would look upon Moses as the great lawgiver and Elijah as the greatest prophet, they need to see both of those subject to Jesus. So in this event, they witness Jesus talking with Moses and Elijah. Moses and Elijah are in glory, but Jesus is in his purity. He is at his best as able to be seen by human eyes. And Moses and Elijah are in dialogue with Jesus, but in a submissive role, less than, lower. These are humans used by God for something greater, whereas Jesus being God above humans. That's the point of this scenario. That's what God wants to play out here on top of the mountain today. The discussion concludes, and Jesus stands alone. He is the one who is over the two previews. And then the cloud comes in, and the voice of God proclaims that. Proclaims that Jesus is greater than. This day is a transition. This is a passing of the torch, if you will, from the old understanding to a new understanding. Jesus is now the one who contains both the laws of Moses and the prophetic voice of Elijah, as well as so much more. The fact that Jesus stands alone on top of the mountain proclaims him to be the greatest. And the voice of God solidifies that coming out of the cloud. The disciples had been schooled in looking back to Moses and Elijah. They are now being schooled to look at Jesus, because Jesus stands alone on the mountaintop. There is nothing, there is no other, even co-equal to him. God has brought all power and authority and vision and expectation together and placed it in Jesus alone. And that moving forward, as was proclaimed by the voice of God, it is Jesus who is to be listened to. No one else. Nothing else. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him. This is not a reassurance. This is more of a command. That the voice of God comes from the voice of Jesus. There is no other voice. There is no other speaker. There is no other voice that has the right or the power to stand on the mountain with Jesus. Now, this is not to say that Moses and Elijah are now unimportant. Heavens no. They're very important. We look back at Moses all the time. But they have been supplanted by the one, the only, the King, Jesus. Today we see that transfer. This is a passing of the torch. We pay witness to God placing on Jesus alone the power of the Word, the power of the divine. And we see that Jesus does with that power. He doesn't stay on the mountain. He doesn't hang out in glory. He doesn't say, okay, now build me a throne and make me a temple. He gets back down with the rabble. Less than 24 hours after being in the presence of the greats of the Old Testament, Jesus is staring down a demon-possessed child. He goes back to work. The Jesus who stands alone on the mountain is the same one in the dirt, casting out demons. As we go up to the mountain today, which we do every year, we are again given this glimpse. We are again reminded that the top belongs to Jesus. That he is still the one who reigns over it all. He is still the one that stands in the glory of God and is still the one whom we should be listening to. His voice. His voice alone. We hear the same words, not as a plea, not as a suggestion. It is a command to us. That Jesus is still the one who deserves our attention. That the voice of God still speaks through Jesus. Now, we have not gotten confused and reverted back to Moses and Elijah. Heavens no. We're okay with Jesus being the top dog over Moses and Elijah. Because when Moses and Elijah had to say, wow, this sounds really good. I'm getting a little falsetto soprano there. Maybe I need a key here. Sorry. We have not been reverted back to Moses and Elijah. And yet, strange as it is, there is always a voice speaking to us that wants to stand with Jesus. We are reminded of this today because we are reminded that it is still our journey of faith to make sure that we do not allow any other voices to stand with Jesus. Let it happen. The devil tries to, yes, of course. But I'm not talking about the devil here. No, I'm talking about something more insidious and more personal. There is a voice that is different for all of us. There is a voice in us that does not allow us to fully submit to the authority of Christ. I'm sure you're waiting for like this big bomb to drop. Pastor's going to pull out some big, huge thing, blow or spit. That's not going to happen. I don't have any flash pops up here or anything. Lights, that'd be pretty cool. No, I'm not going to drop some big bomb about this voice. But there is always a voice inside of us. It's not that simple. A voice of pride or envy or fear or anger or arrogance or elitism or self-righteousness or self-abasement. A voice of yearning to be happy, business, pressure, stress. These are the voices that want to be on the mountaintop with Jesus. These are the voices inside of us that want to stand co-equal with Jesus in the authority of our lives. Voices that say, I know he is the top dog and the one to listen to. But, whenever there's a but, you know something's coming along. I'm too busy. This is more fun. He is boring. No one likes him. He asks too much. I can't give that up. This is more important. There are voices inside of us that want to stand co-equal with Christ on top of the mountain every day. And these words may be different for all of us. They may come from a different place, but underlying they have no different than the message that came from the Old Testament. God is far off. Burnt offerings are the way to go. God is wrathful and vengeful. God has left us. The message is the same. There is something that wants to stand co-equal with God. We are on the mountaintop today. We gaze upon Jesus as he is alone, above all other things, to be reminded again that in our lives, Jesus is the only authority. In our lives, there is only one who is the one, and we profess him as Jesus. We profess that he is the one we should be listening to. His voice and no other. Especially our own. Because our voice wants to speak over him all the time. And as we stand on the mountaintop, we are reminded once again that his voice is the most important. We are reminded that nothing, no one can claim more importance than the voice of Jesus. If Moses and Elijah can't get it, then no one can. It is Jesus who stands alone in glory. It is Jesus' voice that God calls us to listen to, commands us to listen to. Because it is only his voice that's going to lead the flock to where it needs to go. It is only his voice that is going to lead us to paradise. This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him and no other.